Thank you. As someone said after that introduction, I can't wait to hear what I'm going to say. But I appreciate the honor of reporting on the global energy revolution that is taking us to a cheaper, resilient, and carbon neutral future. And the story combines a rapid and irreversible global shift from fossil fuels to renewables, from fuels to electricity, from inefficient to efficient and very efficient use, and from centralized to distributed supply. Together, efficient use, renewable supply, and electrification of heat and mobility are squeezing out fossil fuels. The fuel's large fraction of global energy today is as misleading a guide to their future as was the number of horses in 1900, just before cars displaced them. Every energy-using sector in the United States has already passed peak fossil fuel. The world's total use of fossil fuels roughly peaked around 5 years ago in red, and then began bumping along a plateau with minor excursions due to weather or war. But right around now, led by renewable electricity and electric vehicles, carbon-free power is starting to meet all demand growth, then more, tipping fossil fuels into permanent and steepening decline. The light gray and dark gray scenarios shown at the far right are from Bloomberg New Energy Finance, but they are similarly framed by the International Energy Agency, BP, Shell, McKinsey, Rystad, and many others. Now, energy incumbents and official forecasters tend to think linearly. So EIA's econometric model, based on historical structures and coefficients, misses the story of coal's decline. The forecasts in warm colors simply reset the starting point year by year on a linear extrapolation that is structurally wrong. It is unrelated to the actual behavior in blue. But the new energy reality is not linear, it is exponential. This new normal needs a new and agile mindset because it's hard to catch an exponential curve from behind. Many traditional models are now dangerously misleading. Using year-old data can be hazardous to your financial health. The U.S. shares in this rapid growth, but it dominates old energy industries, not new ones. America is not the technological epicenter of clean energy as it was, say, for the internet. But for now, the clean energy epicenter is China, where far-sighted policies have built about half the world's renewable energy and even more of many of its supply chains. The U.S. is now starting to catch up, but from far behind. Exponential growth in, say, photovoltaics has so far outrun understanding that even the best short-term forecasters, most firmly anchored in tens of thousands of actual projects worldwide, had to raise by 64%, or 173 gigawatts in a 20-month period spanning last year, their forecast of how much photovoltaic capacity the world would install during last year while it was going on. That's an order of magnitude more forecast error than we are used to. And if even those top-tier analysts can't keep up with PV growth as it's happening because it flew past in such a blur, how risky are the old data models and mindsets held by many incumbents? Moreover, the huge and still rapidly growing glut of PV factories guarantees many years of rock-bottom prices as overbuilt makers seek cash flow by selling at or below cost. PV modules are now running around 11 or 12 cents per DC watt. Some European prices undercut other materials for building facades. So it would be worth sheathing your new building in Chinese PV modules, even if they made no electricity. Such prices will keep driving solar levelized cost in this decade to a minor fraction of the short-run marginal cost of running a thermal, legacy power plant. So load defection and grid defection will surely then bite deeply into traditional monopolies' revenues. Here's how the world's electricity generation mix is flipping. The blue curve, or aqua, modern renewables, that's all kinds except big hydro dams, grew faster in the past decade than the fastest historic growth back in the 80s for nuclear power, now stagnant. They've surpassed gas-fired generation. They should surpass coal-fired generation next year. They continue to accelerate. Modern renewables' first trillion watts, a terawatt, in 2016 took about 15 years to build. The next terawatt took 5 years and cost about half as much. The third terawatt is happening right around now, 3 years later. IEA forecasts 3.7 terawatts of renewable additions 2023 to 8. And China added more photovoltaic capacity in the last quarter of last year than in all of the previous year. They added more PV capacity last year than the US had added cumulatively since inventing the technology 69 years earlier. China will meet its 2030 solar and wind target this year, and their carbon emissions probably peaked last year. International Energy Agency predicts global nuclear power will be outgenerated by wind power alone next year, by solar power alone a year later. The world is set to add more renewable capacity in 5 years than in the past century, with wind plus solar overtaking classical hydropower this year. So IEA now predicts 42% renewable global electricity 4 years from now. And of that 42, 25 is from variable renewables, solar and wind. So the revolution already happened. Sorry if you missed it. But the big story starts, as it always should, with an even more formidable competitor we hear a lot less about, using energy more productively. In the past 48 years, saved energy, about 2/3 due to smarter technologies, has dropped US energy use by 64% with a huge cumulative saving. Meanwhile, renewables roughly tripled, nearly tripled, but with 26 times less cumulative impact. Who knew? Renewables get virtually all the headlines because they're visible, while energy is invisible, and the energy you don't use is almost unimaginable. Yet saved energy is half of the world's historic decarbonization and at least half of the world's future decarbonization. Another bit of history. Around 75, US government and industry all said that primary energy intensity, the total energy input needed to make $1 of real GDP, could never drop. A year later, I heretically suggested it could drop 72% in the next 50 years. So far, as I said, it's dropped 64% in 48 years. And yet, just the innovations already added by 2010 can save another threefold, twice what I originally thought, at a third the real cost. And today's that's looking conservative because optimizing buildings, vehicles, factories as whole systems, not as piles of little parts, can often make very big energy savings cost less than small or no savings, turning diminishing returns into increasing returns. Vigorously applied, such integrative design could quintuple global energy productivity by about 2060 or triple it by about 2040, as documented in this foundational paper. I'll give some examples shortly, but notice this is only end-use efficiency, services per unit of final energy delivered to the user. This does not include the 2- or 3-fold upstream savings from electrification with primary renewables. Let me explain that. 3 columns starting on the left illustrate that supply-side shift. At the upper left, the huge conversion losses in red in thermal power plants are eliminated down to the lower left when solar and wind power in green generate electricity directly without a steam cycle. In the middle column, fuel combustion at the top provides heat several-fold less efficiently than a renewably powered heat pump concentrating free low-temperature heat from the environment. And in the right column, gasoline and diesel engines with their big losses in red are far less efficient than renewably powered electric motors in battery electric vehicles. So the systems across the lower row replacing fossil fuels with renewable electricity are several-fold more efficient in turning renewable electricity into delivered services. But this does not yet include higher efficiency in the equipment being powered, or the building being heated, or the vehicle being moved. That's end-use efficiency, and doing it first makes the heat pumps and the EV batteries smaller, cheaper, less mineral intensive. Both these kinds of efficiency multiply to form together primary energy efficiency. And the supply side savings shown here, around 2- or 3-fold, avoid nearly $5 trillion of global waste each year when we get that done. Almost 5% of world GDP. And yet, they're only half as important as the largely overlooked gains in end-use efficiency further downstream. So let me illustrate those. How much electricity, just to cue this up, is the US or the world going to need? Well, nobody knows. The high standard projections risk major overbuilding and stranded assets, and that risk is increasing with the obvious trends, plus some further innovation. For example, in 2021, efficient structural design, which I'll illustrate later, emerged as a proven but very underused way to save half the world's steel and cement. In 2022, so did low-temperature ways to make steel and cement, like electrochemical iron making at 60 degrees C, like a hot cup of coffee, not at 1600 degrees C. And that process works well today at a pilot plant in Boulder, and it likes really low-grade ore and variable renewable electricity. In 2023, geological hydrogen became credible. It may end up saving most or all of the planned green hydrogen and the green electricity to make it. Green hydrogen is great for special uses, but as with carbon capture and storage and geothermal, competition may reveal use cases a lot more limited than promoters are assuming. For example, I doubt any steam cycle will be able to compete. Thus, we are rapidly entering this tricky period when we need not just deployment, but also discernment about how much of what supply we will actually need, what is a climate effective investment, and what's just a shiny object with a slick sales pitch. Meanwhile, of course, full speed ahead on both efficiency and renewables. Endgame details needn't constrain our opening moves, but anyone considering major investments needs to understand the whole competitive landscape, especially the demand side. So don't simply assume that electrification is going to make demand soar. Norway used only modestly more electricity in 2022 as its car fleet became 30% electric, mostly efficient Teslas, and 60% of its relatively efficient housing stock adopted heat pumps, and its GDP more than doubled. A cautionary tale. Now, the world just agreed in Glasgow to double the speed of saving energy overall, and that's before including integrative design. But integrative design can make the end-use efficiency resource I'm about to illustrate several-fold bigger, but actually cost less because it uses not more but fewer devices, and not fancier but simpler devices, more artfully chosen, combined, timed, and sequenced. We're familiar with resources like copper ore bodies and oil reservoirs, finite and depletable assemblages of atoms. In contrast, energy efficiency resources are infinitely expandable assemblages of ideas, depleting only stupidity, a very abundant resource. Let me give you a few examples. Judy and I live 2,200 meters up in the Rocky Mountains near Aspen, where temperatures used to dip as low as minus 44 Celsius, minus 47 F. The central atrium in our house, seen here in a February snowstorm, has so far produced 81 passive solar banana crops. And it was cheaper to build 42 years ago because leaving out the heating system subtracted more construction costs than super efficiency added to get rid of the heating system. Our house helped inspire several 100,000 European passive buildings with no heating and roughly normal construction cost. An analog in Bangkok saved 90% of the air conditioning energy with better comfort and normal construction cost. And nearly everyone on Earth lives in a climate somewhere between Bangkok and Old Snowmass, Colorado. But wherever you live, integrative design gives many benefits from each expenditure. So the white arch at the top of the upper middle photo has 12 functions, but it has only one cost. In 2010, integrative design let our Empire State Building retrofit save 38, later 43% of its energy with a 3-year payback. Now the owner wants to redouble the savings to 80%. 3 years later, our cost-effective retrofit saved 70% on this difficult federal complex in Boulder, half-century old, and made it more efficient than what was then the best new U.S. office. That, in turn, is only a third as efficient as RMI's net positive no mechanicals passive office near our home, now using about a ninth the normal amount of energy in the coldest North American climate zone. Or here's a Bavarian building using 2/5 less energy still. And yet all these technologies existed over a decade ago. What mainly improved is not so much technology as design, how you put the pieces together. It keeps improving. The Dutch Energiesprong method of super outsolation can profitably retrofit most buildings to net zero efficiency by essentially building a tea cozy around the building, and installation can take as little as a day. Now, even in tropical climates, traditional passive building design can keep you feeling about 16 to 19 Celsius cooler, while redesigning big mechanical space cooling systems can at least triple their efficiency, by now quintuple it, all with excellent economics. And then for ordinary window air conditioners, like all these big Asian apartment houses use, RMI's Global Cooling Prize just quintupled efficiency of the air conditioner. That's now heading to market from 2 major vendors. But something even more important just happened. An experiment 5 years ago revealing a startling alternative. It turns out that purely radiative cooling in this open-ended shaded pavilion kept people comfortable outdoors in Singapore without moving, drying, or cooling the air. Again, purely radiatively. People stayed cool just by radiating their body's far infrared rays into panels kept apart with a thin plastic film and an air gap from the humid air, circulating slightly cooled water, and then radiant temperatures around 23 to 25 C could deliver comfort in air up to at least 32 C, 90 F, at 80% relative humidity. Such cooling can then be done often passively with no electricity, potentially about eliminating the world's long-term growth in peak electricity demand. Inside buildings are other surprising opportunities. For example, this fist-sized heat pump can deliver 6 to 15 units of hot water per unit of electricity, while this electric conduction cooking system is 2 to 4.5 times more efficient than induction and otherwise superior. How about industry? It uses half the world's energy and electricity. Well, RMI's latest $60-odd billion worth of industrial redesigns typically found about 30 to 60% energy savings on retrofit, paying back in a few years, and far outperforming the upper left orange zone where most energy service companies deliver disintegrated design. In new projects, across, again, a wide range of industries, integrative design generally yielded 40 to 90+% energy savings, with virtually always lower than normal capital cost. For example, half the world's electricity turns motors, mainly in industry. Half that motor torque turns pumps and fans. But just better pipe and duct design can save 80 to 90-odd% of the friction, and therefore the pumping power. In our house, 97%. If everyone did this, it could save roughly half the world's coal-fired electricity, or a fifth of all electricity, with paybacks typically under a year in retrofit and instant in new build. But this is not yet in any standard engineering textbook, official study, industry forecast, or climate model. Why not? Because it's not a technology, it's a design method. And few people yet think of design as a path to speed and scale. To wring out friction, we simply use big pipes and small pumps, not small pipes and big pumps. We raise up the pump to meet the pipe rather than dipping the pipe down to a pump on the floor and back up again, so that gets rid of 4 elbows. And then to eliminate elbows in their friction, we lay out the pipes first, then the equipment. So these tan chillers, originally in a straight line, get staggered until the elbows go away. So we lay out supply pipes as if they were drains. We bend minds, not pipes. Now think of the whole power and pumping system. From the fuel burned at the thermal power station to the end use, many successive losses compound. So only 1/10 of the energy in the fuel comes out the pipe as flow. But now turn those compounding losses around backwards, right to left, and they become compounding savings. Every unit of flow or friction you save in the pipe saves 10 units of fuel cost emissions and what Amory Lovins calls global weirding back at the power plant. And as you go back upstream, the components get smaller and cheaper, so the total capital cost goes down. And then once your pump or fan needs 5 or 10 times less torque, you can replace that big inefficient motor system with a new right-sized super efficient one that saves around half the remaining energy by 35 integrated improvements, of which 28 are free byproduct to the first 7. That saves twice as much drive system energy as the usual 2 or 3 disintegrated improvements at a fifth the unit cost. And it raises the potential savings in fluid handling system energy from a fifth to a third of global electricity use. That's an awful lot to be missing from our climate models and our utility demand forecasts. Now let's apply the same logic to big old data centers. 2/3 of the fuel fed into the power plant is lost in the plant and grid. Half the metered electricity is lost in the cooling system and uninterruptible power supplies, together about half the total capital cost, before it gets to the servers. And then half the server energy doesn't even reach the chips because it's lost in inefficient and usually very underloaded power supplies and lots of superfluous fans. Next comes severe underutilization of computing resources, partly through insufficient virtualization. Now the resulting energy flow down there is about to vanish, so let's magnify it. Next comes bloatware, running many unnecessary threads and processes and making simple tasks very complex because compute cycles were cheaper than programmers' attention and someone else bought the electricity. Downstream of all that, you may even have inefficient business processes. In all, the red numbers at the bottom reveal that just a few 100,000ths of the original fuel energy is actually delivering customer value. Where should we start fixing this? Downstream. Start at the end. First, write elegantly terse code, optimally compiled, with the goal that every compute cycle is a needed and wanted one. I had assumed this could save an order of magnitude in compute cycles, but recent tests suggest it's 2 orders of magnitude. And now, of course, the shift to mobile devices makes this very worthwhile because efficient code valuably stretches battery life. Next, you can at least quadruple, now more, the server efficiency. And the servers will then need a lot less cooling and power supply, both of which can be done in smarter ways. And we could even save half the utility losses with fuel cell trigeneration, cheaper up front than the UPSs it displaces. So when you multiply these savings from downstream to upstream, as in the pumping diagram, you cut the energy use by at least 2 orders of magnitude. In the project for which we made this diagram, 15 years ago, the client rejected most of our recommendations, so we were only able to triple efficiency at the same capital cost. Very disappointing. We hardly ever do that badly. But our partner EDS said that had our recommendations they agreed with, which was practically all of them, been adopted, you would have saved about 95% of the data center's energy and half its capital cost. It's a long way to go. Even without most of the integrated design or many other innovations, U.S. electricity use could shrink by a quarter by 2050, despite all electric cars and a 2.6-fold bigger GDP. That's a quadrupling of electric end-use efficiency. And it wasn't nearly as much as we should have bought because it turned out that quadrupled efficiency would save kilowatt hours at an average cost just 1/10 the retail price of the electricity we were saving. So we should have bought a lot more efficiency than in this 2011 analysis. And don't forget materials efficiency. Strong literature I synthesized 3 years ago showed how smarter structural design and new business models can profitably save at least half the world's cement and steel that now release about 15% of global CO2. Now, better specification and application of concrete, not slopping it around the job site, can save another factor 2, together saving about 3/4 before adopting lower carbon materials or production processes. But let me just give you a few examples of the better structural design that's generally overlooked. Substituting tension for compression structures typically looks better, costs less, uses about 1/8 the tons. Pouring concrete into curvy fabric forms, not rigid prismatic forms, can often save over half the concrete by putting strength and stiffness only where they're needed. And then the weight savings compound because you need less strength to hold up less weight. An airy 3D printed bridge can carry mainly its users, while massive concrete bridges support mainly their own weight. By the way, here's a 3D printed stainless steel bridge in Holland. Most importantly, floor slabs like this are about half the total weight of a typical mid or high-rise building, and a 5 centimeter thick concrete floor slab folded like corrugated cardboard or shallow vaulted dome can replace a 30 centimeter thick flat slab. It costs less, it saves 3/4 of the cement, and it eliminates the steel. Well, thin floor slabs and better energy design can save a further 15% of core structural materials and 3/4 of the energy in a new mid or high-rise building like this one in Singapore, while increasing net rentable space by a stunning 55%. How do you do that? Well, you design out a vertical meter at the far left of mechanical plenum at each story, and then with the thin slabs and passive design, you can fit 3 stories with unchanged 2.8 meter ceiling height into the current height of 2 stories. Cost, complexity, and time all fall dramatically. Why would you build any other way once you see this? And cement, by the way, is just the start. Our 99 book with Paul Hawken, Natural Capitalism, found that the U.S. economy's mass flow is over 99.9% pure waste, perhaps the biggest business bonanza on the planet. As we electrify mobility, remember that 2/3 of the energy needed to move a car is caused by its weight. BMW showed how integrative design can lightweight a car at competitive cost, even at the 2013 carbon fiber prices. So this i3 that I drive made money from the first unit off the assembly line. Its carbon fiber is paid for by the batteries that its lightness saves, batteries being the costliest part of an EV. And of course, fewer batteries mean faster recharging with less electricity, infrastructure, emissions, and investment, worth, EPRI just figured, about $200 billion a year. This car's integrative design snowballs weight savings far more than usually assumed. Its manufacturing is radically frugal, eliminates the 2 hardest and costliest steps in automaking, much better for workers, and the efficiency quadruples without compromise to the equivalent of 124 miles a gallon, and with many driver advantages, of which my favorite is half the normal turn radius. The next game changer could be a couple of hypercars from little firms I advise, both production ready, both now raising the rest of their production capital. Most drivers will not need to recharge this American carbon fiber 2-seat 3-wheeler or this Dutch metal 5-seat 4-wheeler because they're close to 3 times as efficient as a Tesla, so their topside solar cells capture enough energy for ordinary daily driving without plugging in, bypassing the charging infrastructure and its electricity supplies. And both of these can be further improved. Tesla's semi-heavy truck, all electric, is 3 to 6 times more efficient than today's Class 8 truck fleet. Or this quiet omni-fuel diesel air taxi with more than 8,000 kilometer range has 1/8 the operating cost and fuel use of a business jet. It can profitably scale up to about 737 size. So aviation's now on the same track as electric vehicles. They were ridiculed a decade or so ago as impractical and unaffordable. Now they're likely to take 2/3 of the world market over the next decade. EPs, electric planes, are now evolving or co-evolving even faster than EVs. Innovations in both strongly reinforce each other, like, say, Denso's 25 kilowatts per kilogram aviation motor. That's twice the power density of the best EV motor, 3 times Tesla, 5 or 10 times most. And now there's a new kind of aerospace structure, a polymer lattice covered by a tough polymer membrane that can make metal wings or other aerostructures about 60 times, not percent, 60 times lighter weight, but tougher and stronger. Now add up all these and many other savings, and the hydrocarbon reserves unsellable for competitive reasons look bigger than the reserves unburnable for climate reasons, putting owners even more at risk from market competition than from climate regulation. You know, the cost of getting U.S. autos completely off oil has now fallen from $18 a saved barrel 13 years ago to under $7 today, heading below zero over the next few years. So oil has become uncompetitive, even at low prices, before it became unaffordable or unavailable, I should say, even at high prices. And now methane gas is on this track too, with every market under competitive threat. And competition with efficient use is especially keen. With fuels and electricity, technology and design are both moving efficiency into fast forward. For example, prior lighting improvements were largely swept away as LEDs in a decade got 30 times more efficient, 20 times brighter, 10 times cheaper. Ultimately, they'll save about an eighth of the world's electricity. But that then helps pry open an old crack in utilities' business model. You see, Thomas Edison didn't sell electricity, he sold light. He would charge you a cent to run a lamp for an hour, so that future lighting efficiency gains would cut his cost of delivering light and increase his profits. But he was overruled in 1892 when New York Edison Company switched to selling kilowatt hours. So efficient use cut their revenues. Oops, upside down revenue model. Utilities are selling a commodity, but customers want an infrastructure or a service. Hot showers, cold beer. Oil and gas firms made the same mistake, selling molecules, not services like comfort and mobility. So we need to sell the desired services to align producers with customers' interests. Right now they're contrary. Now what else changes this fast? Modern renewables, as you saw before. LEDs backwards are PVs, photovoltaics. Solar and in aqua wind power costs have plunged below the dashed lines, the cost of existing steam plants' fossil fuels, and that often makes those plants uneconomic just to run. But the revolution goes much, much deeper. We're shifting from molecules and atoms to bits and packets, from hardware to software, from hierarchies to networks. Electricity is changing from centralized, supply-focused, fossil and uranium-fueled and brittle to customer-focused, distributed, renewable, resilient. And maybe the deepest change is how the information age informs, enables, and organizes customers to take power back into their own hands. You know, it's wise to sell customers what they want before someone else does. Well, customers are figuring out they can buy fewer electrons, use them more productively and more timely, produce their own, and even trade them with each other. Dutch customers can buy renewable electricity directly from other customers on this peer-to-peer website of Van de Bron, literally from the source. A friend of mine bought his electricity from the guy in the upper left photo because the price was right in magenta, and it's a really cute piglet. And then he got a long handwritten Christmas card from his electricity supplier. What big utility can dream of such customer intimacy? Indeed, powerful disruptors are converging on the electricity industry from at least 8 directions. And these 8 Pac-Men of the apocalypse move fast. They don't just add, they exponentiate. They're not lone wolves, they hunt in packs. They multiply quickly. They can gobble up half of utility revenues in this decade. And together they are creating an alien competitive landscape faster than most utility cultures can cope. A decade ago, all central power plants were called dinosaurs, and the full quote was, "Too big, too inflexible, not even relevant for backup power in the long run." Who do you suppose said that? It wasn't Greenpeace, it was Union Bank of Switzerland. And now a whole new wave of Pac-Men is coming over the hill with more behind them. Indeed, the death spiral I described in 1976, stagnant or falling demand and soaring price, already seems to be emerging not a million miles from here. Renewable power keeps accelerating. IEA estimates 96% of the new solar and onshore wind power last year was cheaper than new coal or gas plants, and about 3/4 of it beat existing fossil fuel plants' operating cost alone. Bloomberg confirmed that the cheapest way to meet a flat load is now solar or wind power plus backup, but the backup can be demand side, storage, renewable, or fueled. It doesn't have to be another power plant. And costs are flat for fossil fueled power, they're rising for nuclear, but they keep falling for renewables and storage. So no wonder 94% of this year's US capacity additions are expected to be renewable. Now, this familiar history from Bloomberg of levelized wholesale costs shows how unsubsidized renewables win and keep pulling ahead. As the columnist Tom Friedman says, the more renewables we buy, the cheaper they get, so we buy more, so they get cheaper. And surprising some pundits, adding the costs of grid integration for all the technologies shown would actually widen renewables' cost advantage. Modern comparisons, though, are not between individual technologies, but between clean energy portfolios that integrate a locally optimized mix of renewables, efficiency, demand response, storage. 5 years ago, RMI's update found such portfolios could beat over 90% of proposed US combined cycle gas plants and beat just the operating cost of existing ones by the early 2030s. Efficiency and demand response sped that win by a decade. Then the analysis got further refined with similar findings. In fact, in the whole United States, only one gas plant looked briefly viable. Investors promptly canceled many of the rest. And another report, now 3 years ago, surveyed 7 all-source procurements that recently competed clean energy portfolios against new combined cycle gas plants. Just over 1% of all the capacity procured was gas-fired, and that in very special circumstances, and planned to run rarely. So really, with no business case for new gas power, in recent months we see what seems a coordinated campaign to conjure a new AI-driven power emergency to justify gas plants and mythical small modular reactors, much as the coal industry tried in the 90s, so caveat lector. Now, our grids for transmission do need help. There's about 1.7 terawatts of renewables, or 5 times existing solar, wind, and battery capacity, or twice total US generating capacity, stuck in interconnection queues waiting to hook up, with approval times upward of 3 years, even a decade, and no certainty of success. But transmission can often be displaced by efficiency, demand response, and distributed resources, including rooftop PVs, that now competitively produce a third of US solar output. And there's actually also a new type of advanced transmission conductor that looks important. Full disclosure, I'm a paid advisor to its maker in Southern California. And compared to the ubiquitous steel core aluminum conductors, this carbon fiber core is so light and strong that you can pack a lot more aluminum conductor on it and double or triple the amount of current it can carry with half the losses, and everything else gets better, including economics. So this would be an important way to decongest a lot of regional grids for rapid renewable expansion by reconductoring existing towers without a new right-of-way. Berkeley's Haas School found that an older and better known but less capable kind of advanced conductor, which only doubles ampacity, could nearly quadruple the US transmission addable by 2035, and we can now do even better than that. So for stalled renewables and congested grids, help is on the way. Further unburdening transmission, decentralized generation is accelerating, and it ought to improve reliability and resilience. A century ago, generation cost more but was less reliable than the grid. And now the grid is costlier and less reliable than the generation. And big power plants are often outcompeted by small ones. So the economic logic of my 2002 book, Small is Profitable, is reflected in the forecasted 95% shrinkage of the median European power plant by 2050. And by then, 2/3 of generation would feed directly into the distribution grid. In fact, for the last 4 years, US rooftop solar has averaged cheaper than retail grid power. Now, renewables also scale up in a fundamentally different way. Traditionally, we built giant cathedral-like power plants, each costing billions of dollars, taking many years to license and build. But now, each year, with roughly comparable capital, you can build a factory that produces each year thereafter enough solar cells to generate each year thereafter as much electricity as your cathedral will ultimately make. So solar output worldwide has scaled faster than cell phones. Big, slow, complex power plants of any kind cannot catch up, and about 90% of the net capacity being added worldwide is now renewable. It can move incredibly quickly. For example, coal-dependent Vietnam built in 1 year over 9 gigawatts of new rooftop solar. That was equivalent in output to building half the nation's coal plants in a year once the grid catches up. And 72% of that was installed just in December before a 9-month window closed on a juicy feed-in tariff. And most of that was in the last week of December. I don't think they got much sleep. China has a whole county rooftop solar program that does centralized auction and batch installation across the rooftops of an entire region. So in China, rooftop photovoltaics were not a thing in 2017. 5 years later, they were 2/5 of the total and 3/5 of the new Chinese solar power. 1 of every 4 solar panels in the world was on a Chinese rooftop. Wow. Globally last year, distributed solar got as much investment as utility scale solar, and it continues to soar. All this means we don't need speculative, slow, and costly technologies like fusion or fission, except, of course, the well-engineered and remotely sited free fusion reactor already thoughtfully provided. However, we should be glad it's 150 million kilometers away because sometimes it burps, and such solar flares will sooner or later destroy any unprotected power grid, as many now are. Next year's forecasted peak is arriving early, expected to be especially intense. The recent New Yorker article called Starburst explains why that matters. I hope the lights stay on. And against all these threats and more, our best protection is a portfolio of efficiently used, diverse, dispersed, renewable, resilient power sources that are the right size for the task, especially right on our roofs, not at the other end of a vast and brittle grid. And they should be wired to work with or without the grid, as our house does. That resilient hookup, and there's a IEEE standard 1547 that makes it safe for the line workers, ought to be our standard retail practice and a crucial element of national security. But carbon-free power is necessary, but it's not sufficient. We also need cheap and fast. So we need to count carbon and cost and speed. At actual market prices and deployment speeds, new nuclear plants would save many-fold less carbon per dollar and per year than cheaper, faster efficiency or modern renewables, and that makes climate change worse. Just operating, let alone further subsidizing existing reactors, wastes money that could buy cheaper options, saving even more carbon. So the more urgent you think climate change is, the more vital it is to buy cheap, fast, proven solutions, not costly, slow, speculative ones. When someone says climate change is so urgent that we need all of the above, remember Peter Bradford's reply. He said, we're not picking and backing winners. They don't need it. We're picking and backing losers. That makes climate change worse. There is, by the way, no proposed change in size, technology, or fuel cycle that would change these conclusions. Global nuclear each year adds at most as much supply as renewables add every few days, and a climate non-solution is not worth paying for, let alone extra. The technology simply has no business case and no operational need. It offers no benefits for grid reliability or resilience that would justify special treatment. In fact, its inflexibility and ungraceful failures complicate modern grid operations, and it hogs grid and market space that cheaper renewables are barred from contesting. Yet we're still told that only old coal, gas, and nuclear plants can keep the lights on because they are 24/7, while wind power and solar are variable and hence unreliable. But variable doesn't mean unpredictable. Here's how accurately the French grid operator in a stormy winter month a decade ago forecast 1 day ahead the output of the country's wind farms. They would do well to forecast demand that accurately. And forecasting has since improved so much that East Danish wind operators bid day-ahead wind power into the grid's hourly auction for balancing reserves, bidding upward and downward regulation just as confidently as fossil fuel plants do. In fact, we built the grid because no generator is 24/7. They all break. And when a giant plant fails, you lose a gigawatt, a billion watts in milliseconds, often abruptly, often for weeks or months. Well, grids manage this intermittence by backing up failed plants with working plants. And in exactly the same way, but often at lower cost, grids can manage the forecastable variations of solar and wind power by backing up those variable renewables with a portfolio of other renewables, all forecasted, integrated, and diversified by type and location. So in hot and often humid Texas, with a 99% isolated grid and no big hydro, a 2050 summer week's expected lows, these are old data but they scale, can get a lot smaller and less peaky with profitably efficient use. Then we can make 86% of the annual electricity with wind and solar. Yes, they're very variable. And 14% from dispatchable renewables. The 100% renewable supply that gives you can then match the load by putting the surplus electricity into two kinds of distributed storage worth buying anyway: ice storage, air conditioning, and smart bidirectional charging of electric autos. Then you can recover that distributed storage when needed and fill the last gaps with unobtrusively flexible demand. And now you've got 100% renewable electricity every hour of the year with no bulk storage and with only about 5% left over to help decarbonize other sectors. So the economics should be excellent even at today's prices. But this is not just theoretical. Some grid operators are doing this choreography routinely. Germany, Britain, Ireland, Lithuania are about half renewably powered. Denmark's well over 80%, Scotland around 100. And already they and some other European countries out of the end of the grid with modest or no hydropower are meeting about half to three-fourths or more of their annual electricity needs from renewables, yet they added no bulk storage and their reliability is a lot better than ours and rising. The 99.999% reliable former East German utility, 50 Hertz, was 65% renewably powered a couple of years ago and targets 100% reliably integrated by 2032. So, as my colleague Clay Stranger says, these operators have learned to run their grids the way a conductor leads a symphony orchestra. No instrument plays all the time, but the ensemble together continuously makes beautiful music. California's biggest power supplier in recent weeks has often been batteries for multiple evening hours, with more than 10 gigawatts of big batteries meeting as much as 27% of demand. As of May 3rd, the wind, water, and solar share had exceeded 100% of demand sometime on the past 19 consecutive days, anywhere from a quarter hour to 9 hours or more, and for 48 of the previous 56 days. Solar and battery records are also tumbling in Texas. They have over 2 gigawatts of peak demand coming from batteries. They're adding another 5 gigawatts this year. Both those states have lately exceeded 18 gigawatts of solar output. Where are such examples heading? Well, a little postcard from the future. This is a monthly 24-year record of such trends in the gigawatt scale grid of the state of South Australia. And the operator says they should complete that transition to 100% solar and wind generation in the next few years. So solar in yellow and wind in green have already displaced essentially all the coal, the imports in purple, and most of the methane gas, light and dark brown, with very successful and lucrative stabilization by big batteries. The highest renewable oversupply was 264% of peak demand. Last October, wind and solar met 87% of the state's total monthly electricity needs, and the stability and economics have been excellent. But despite such empirical examples, standard models say we need giant fossil or nuclear plants to keep the grid reliable as it becomes renewable. That's actually a modeling error. It's an artifact of omitting most of the grid balancing resources. Their full competitive landscape includes 10 carbon-free ways to balance the grid across all timescales, not just big batteries in magenta and without needing fossil backup in red. Now, this is conceptual and schematic. Your actual costs will vary. But the point is that bulk storage comes last, not first, so we needn't wait for a storage miracle, although some are emerging, and the market isn't waiting. Today's exponential battery growth could get global power over 60% of the way to net zero, but it's not the only option. The first two boxes on the left, the cheapest ones, negawatts and flexawatts, that is efficient and timely use of power, are both several-fold bigger than had been thought, but cheaper, and many other options remain neglected. So giant batteries, currently the costliest option, are valuable and they're profitable, but they seldom look necessary. And because 3/4 of U.S. electricity powers buildings, making buildings more efficient can dramatically shrink and shift peak loads and improve grid balancing. So National Renewable Energy Lab, a few years ago, did something unusual. They decided to compete efficiency against storage, not against supply. And they conservatively found that better building efficiency can cut investments by an order of magnitude by displacing most or all of the long-duration hydrogen storage and the green electricity to produce it. Long, calm, cloudy periods are often raised as another objection to renewables, but 50 Hertz has analyzed Europe's Dunkelflaute, the dark doldrums, widely claimed to need months or seasons or even years of backup power. It turns out the actual need is only up to a week or two per year, totaling about 6% of winter electricity use. And that could come just from existing gas-fired plants building green molecules like hydrogen or ammonia made at other times from surplus solar and wind. So the long assumed need for massive long-duration storage was not found, partly because this study included 4 of our 10 grid balancing resources, not 1 or 0. One last thought about markets. Energy transformations can flip markets with breathtaking speed. On Fifth Avenue in New York City, in 1900, you have to look hard for the first car. There it is. 13 years later, you have to look harder for the last horse. The horse and buggy industry thought it would have many decades to adapt, but the Model T got 62% cheaper in 13 years. Car-owning households, it's okay, gravity, soared from, very reliable, from 8% to about 60% in a decade, 3/4 of them financed by a GM and DuPont innovation called car loans. Well, today our solar modules just got 80% cheaper in 5 years. They got 2-fold cheaper last year alone. 3/4 of U.S. rooftop solar is innovatively financed, and Ford's and Edison's industries are merging to eat Rockefeller's industry. So the pace of transformation is set not by incumbents, but by insurgents. They're not inhibited by incumbents' business models or cultures or legacy assets. And in fact, investors flee before customers do, because capital markets keenly sniff out disruption. And once they think you're in or even headed for the toaster, they don't wait for the toast to get done before they decapitalize you and invest in your successors. Already, trillions of dollars have prudently fled the fossil fuel industries as they hemorrhage capital, talent, and political clout. Before Putin's war, the world's top 16 listed hydrocarbon companies combined were worth less than Apple. And all of the world's significant automakers combined were worth less than Tesla. In the coming turbulence, customers may bypass unloved suppliers. Many regulators must play catch-up. Pre-stranded assets will abound, and business as usual will become the riskiest thing you can do. Our responsibility and opportunity is to help enable the new energy system, not protect the old, to build back better, to move fast and fix things, so the global energy transformation can move at the cost and pace of design and software, not of infrastructure, and can be not constrained by the inertia of incumbents, but sped by the ambition of insurgents like you. Thanks for your kind attention. I'm eager to hear what's on the line.
Amory just asked me what's a fireside chat with no fire. So
there's so many metaphors we're going to have to revise.
Amory wrote a fabulous book called Reinventing Fire. So maybe this is the Reinventing Fire chat. How's that? And I want to own the fact for everyone, if Dave Welch wasn't having a bit of an allergy issue, he would be sitting here in my place. And I want to, for those of you that came in late, part of the wonder of the Foster, Woven Earth Ventures, Amory Lovins, us all being together, and Nostera, is that I actually met Heidi Welch, Dave's beautiful wife, about 28 years ago, sitting in a swimming pool with our 2 or 3-year-old children. And since then, she and I have had a whole pathway of some initiatives at Stanford around decarbonization. And one of the first times I met Dave, how long have you been a trustee at NRDC? Yeah, so, and the Natural Resources Defense Council, commonly known as NRDC, is been a great, along with RMI, have been 2 of my favorite leading NGOs in this space around the topics that Amory's been discussing, and our friend Ralph Cavanagh, continues to collaborate with Amory. So I have the privilege of fielding some questions on Amory, that are going to come here to Amory. He covered an amazing, it was a tour de force of thinking about, much like, it's the modern version of the very first conversation, the very first presentation I heard you give. So Amory himself is a renewable energy resource, as far as I'm concerned. His ability to continue to tell the story.
You just wind up the key every morning.
There we go. There we go. I think Pat, there are microphones here. And I see many friends in the audience and new faces. And Amory, there's no dumb question. So we'd love to encourage the audience to take a point at some of it doesn't even have to be something Amory discussed, but something you've been curious about that you'd love to bring his direction. Hi there.
Amory, Ami Amarnath from EPRI. Great presentation. Obviously, I've seen many of your presentations in the past. This is absolutely great. What is missing in the presentation is payback periods, cost effectiveness of these technologies. Let me just give you a quick example. You talk about heat pumps, okay? Installation of heat pumps here in California, especially here in Northern California, it's kind of a nightmare, to be honest with you. Because we have to just not put the heat pump, we got to upgrade our electrical panel, we got to change our ducting completely. There are a lot of other costs involved, and I didn't hear you talk about any of those costs or payback periods for efficiency improvements. Can you elaborate a little bit on those?
Yeah, we use empirical costs, prices, and rates of return. In Reinventing Fire, for example, where we showed how to quadruple electric and use efficiency, trying to remember the exact numbers, but I believe it was well in the 30s% internal rate of return for all the building retrofits based on measured data, admittedly from good programs, not from bad programs. And in industry, it was in the 20s and getting rid of oil in the high teens or so. And now it would be a good deal cheaper than that. Heat pumps, which I didn't talk about except in the water heating context, are an interesting example because their sales keep going up until just the last year or so, when their share has gone up, but the total heating system sales have gone down with interest rates and such. They vary widely in efficiency and quality, but basically you can save enough money in an average cooler part of the country putting in a good heat pump to pay for your neighbor to do the same thing, or a good water heating heat pump can save enough money, can save enough electricity to run an electric car. So there are these reinvestment cascades possible. Now, California is probably not a very good place to pick for your example because you have the sort of soaring electricity price you saw in the graph for PG&E residential. But in, say, the Pacific Northwest, which has been more sensible in policy and regulation, I think you have a very encouraging heat pump picture. and in much of the rest of the country as well. But I would find it hard to defend the current course of utility regulation in California, which seems determined to wipe out a good deal of the renewable industry. I don't know why. Also, very important, how efficient is the house you're putting the heat pump into? It may well be a better deal to retrofit the house till it doesn't need heat or needs hardly any. And you're going to have a hot water system anyway of some sort. So if you're worried about a few nights a year when it's especially cold, you could just valve a shower's worth of hot water into a baseboard heater or a radiant heater and not have a separate heating appliance. The main case for heat pumps is in climates where you want both heating and cooling, but the same things you could do to retrofit the house may well eliminate and will certainly dramatically shrink heating and cooling, even in a state that has long had strong building codes like California. And that goes back to the PG&E Act Squared experiment that some of us did a long time ago, probably some people in this room, where we could, in both commercial and residential, we could save most of the energy used by a house that supposedly already contained all the efficiency worth buying, but it didn't, because the code wasn't written with integrative design in mind.
Another question, Pat, from our friends.
When you were talking about China and their meteoric renewable generation, how do you view some of the investments that China and the Chinese investment engine is making into countries that don't have money? And I'm talking about, say, Afghanistan or Indonesia, where everything is, China is building 4 gigawatts, even 8 gigawatts of coal power plants using their money, but their own country, they are going renewable. So how do you reconcile that?
It's a very complex picture, and there are a lot of reasons for what Belt and Road does that have nothing to do with energy and climate. That said, a very important thing China has done is to build already about 600 gigawatts a year of photovoltaic module production capacity in a world that installed like 443, I think, last year. And by the end of this year, that 600 capacity will be about 1,000 gigawatts a year. That's enough to last till 2030. And what that does is not only severely depress prices, but also make it very hard for other countries to build their own capacity, because they have to build a new plant to compete with just the bare running cost of the old plant trying to eke out cash flow. So by that kind of preemptive move on global supply chains, China has locked in a lot of dominance that will last for a long time. There are some very good websites tracking global coal plant construction, and basically many of those will not be built or will not run much, and the same is true in China, where for odd reasons of a governor or mayor wanting to meet GDP growth targets or keep power plant workers in jobs or coal miners in jobs, coal plants are still being built, even though it's obvious they won't run. Their capacity factors keep dropping, on average a couple of points a year, and yet the government is willing to overlook that and buy kind of an insurance policy in case there's some bizarre, Tamboro eruption kind of event. But if you look at where the investment's going in China, clearly the nuclear investment is tapering off rather rapidly while the renewable investment is soaring. And it turns out some of the best analysts are now showing a lot of the investment that was going into building vast apartment complexes in the wrong place to sit idle, causing the real estate bubble. That capital is now being pulled back into productive industries that will meet national strategic goals, most of all renewables. So there's a big influx of capital to build plants to make solar, wind, and battery capacity in electric vehicles. It's really a remarkable policy, and it may be painful for some of our industries, but it's good for the world in many ways.
Looks like Dave's got a question.
I'm going to try.
Good.
One comment. I love your comment on we should be selling light and not electricity. And it is so true that if you have a vertically integrated industry, they will optimize, and they'll optimize faster than a bifurcated industry. So I'm not actually suggesting that we pay per lumen, but that's part of the problem of the adoption of innovative design, is the way it's the market partitions it. At least that's my understanding. My question is, you just mentioned something I don't understand, which is why are California rates going up, and how does that, how do you see the impact of that to the adoption of green energy in the state?
You're talking about PG&E in particular? Well, it's not the company I used to know. I think they've had some really serious management, cultural, and regulatory problems all at once. And on top of that, wildfires, a bunch of other stuff. Some under their control, some not. But where that curve is headed with demand doing this and price doing that is not going to hold up. And when they try to put in more exit fees, I think people will drop off the grid or stay connected but not buy much, respectively grid defection and load defection. And I don't know any law that says you have to buy electricity from a utility. It's cheaper not to now.
I think there are a few more questions from our audience. We'll come to you in just one sec. I'm going to be selfish since this is supposed to be this chat. But I also want to, what I bring to you all, what I hope will feel like a gift, which is Amory and I both have the privilege of being around another renewable energy source, which is Stanford students. So I have the privilege of delivering a class called Understand Energy, and another class with folks from Breakthrough Energy Ventures called Stanford Climate Ventures. It's a company innovation class. Amory's been delivering a class called Extreme Energy Efficiency, really teaching this practice of integrative design. And Amory, I would be grateful if you could give this audience, who doesn't get to be in your class, a sense of what is it at this stage in your career, what is the experience for you of interacting with this ever more gifted, more open-minded group of students from all over the world who are in your classroom? Can you share what it's like for our audience?
It's terrific. You know, we use flipped classrooms, so they view a bunch of pretty chock-full lectures, maybe 15 of them on their own time between classes, but we use the class, some for discussion, but mostly for puzzlers, where I set a design problem that they've never thought about before, so they must use beginner's mind. In small groups, they design a solution to this bizarre problem. And by the time they've done 8 or 9 of those, they're really good integrative designers. They can apply 10 principles or pillars of practical integrative design, and it really rearranges their mental furniture so they will think differently about any problem in any discipline. Only about 2/3 of them are engineers. We have business and law students, Chinese art history, cultural anthropology, you name it. And there's, I think, one equation in the whole course. It's not about theory, but it's definitely about thinking differently. And it is very exciting to have them contribute to making it better. We're on, I think, 12th iteration now. Tomorrow night, Judy and I go to Australia to teach the teachers how to do this stuff. We've just done it in India. We're about to do it in Sweden, Germany, and Switzerland. So we're planting these seeds that I think will take students like Stanford students, including about 3 million a year graduating engineers in India and China, and start to get this design turned from rare to standard practice.
Thank you. And we're coming to your question in just a moment. I want to make a future pitch that I'll get Nastera to help us with, which is I've built a website with the help of colleagues around the Understand Energy class that basically puts the content of that class on the web for the world, and we're now building an Understand Extreme Energy Efficiency and Integrative Design Learning Hub. So basically all the best of Amory Lovins curated in one place, but for kind of this teach the teachers, but teach an audience like this, what is the practice that Amory's been operating within?
Yeah,
It's something we're trying to make it available to everyone.
And a lot of our students are quite accomplished. One grad student I had in the course last term was running Tesla's semi-electric truck program, among other things. Another of our grad students found, after a year and a half of our failure, the best Chinese title for our new monograph late this year, I hope, called The Tao of Pipes, which will go to 17,000 biggest Chinese factories' chief engineers and tell them how to do fat, short, straight pipes and pumps in a way they can discover for themselves and own it by looking at pictures.
I don't know where our microphone is, but I know there's you've got it. Please share your question.
Yeah, thank you. Amory, just a fantastic presentation. You covered how important design is and efficiency. I'm wondering, when you consider both those factors, do we have to be worried about the issue of material shortage at all? You know, when we're talking about these new technologies, we're talking about batteries, we're talking about lithium, those kinds of things. Is that an issue?
It could be if we were particularly dumb about it. And I'm dismayed that outfits that should know better, including our Departments of Energy and Defense and the International Energy Agency, treat the amount of a given metal you need to make a given number of cars as a point value. They should parameterize it because it's flexible by a factor 2 or 3 according to the efficiency of the car, and even more than that if you get toward the cutting-edge hypercar sorts of concepts I showed. And actually the efficiency of the car is just one of 6 multiplicative layers of ways to manage this problem, written up in a little blog called, let's see, if you search on Lovins 6 Solutions to Battery Minerals Problems, I think you'll find it.
Thank you for the question.
So there are still some issues, short-term in particular, but I'm not particularly worried about it, and there's plenty of material to do everything we need to do. The only material I have a long-term concern about is phosphorus.
There you go. We have one more question, and then Amory will be available. He has to leave in a little bit, but we're going to disperse after this one fantastic question.
Okay, no pressure. Hi, Dr. Lovins. I took your class last quarter, Extreme Energy Efficiency.
And you recovered.
Yeah, great course. He speaks the truth. I have a question. I remember a slide that you had about the Netherlands and their ability to purchase electricity from different providers.
I'm not quite getting it.
The electricity generation.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, I was wondering in cases
it's like
that.
a file swapping music site.
Yeah, exactly. In cases like that, I was wondering who's incurring the cost of infrastructure when that process might favor smaller utility providers?
Well, these aren't utilities. These are individual customers that make their own electricity and swap it with others or sell it to others. So the grid is set up in such a way that the kind of behind the curtains transaction cost of moving the money and electrons around is done as a grid function. and all customers support that in socialized fashion because it's a public benefit, public service. Van de Bron, you can look up. I think it's a nonprofit, but I'd have to check. But the transaction costs are quite small, and it's, you know, the infrastructure for swapping resources in this way, starting with music, is now pretty widespread. So I don't think the software is unduly complicated.
Thank you.
But who's paying for to support the grid physically?
I'm sorry?
Who's supporting the utility grid that is being used for those transactions?
Well, but remember the European graph where the generators get dramatically smaller over the coming decades, so that by the time you're done, 2/3 of the power is fed straight into the distribution grid without transmission.
It's all distributed.
Yeah, and you know, we move electrons on average several hundred kilometers, but 98 or 99%, last I heard from EPRI years ago, I know we need to know the new number, of power failures originate in the grid. That's a problem with central plants that absolutely depend on the grid to move electrons a long distance. If they move from your roof to your refrigerator, there's not nearly as much to go wrong, and you can get, in principle, 1 or 2 orders of magnitude better reliability and much greater resilience.
We still need a distribution system somehow.
Yeah, the distribution system's where most of the money is, but remember that when we first moved into the banana farm in '84, before we had solar at all, our household electric bill for 4,000 square feet was $5 a month at a 7-cent tariff, and our co-op came out twice to change the meter because they thought I'd found a way to move the decimal point.
All right. Thank you so much, Amory.
Thank you.
Your job now is to stand up, walk into the back, grab another drink, enjoy yourself with some of the food that we have, and get to know some folks that you haven't met yet. Thank you very much. And thank you to Linda and her team here at the Foster and Tanya and Woven Ventures. Thank you.